webinar on improving the relevance of drug interaction warnings. Today we want to talk about a drug interaction warning between warfarin and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents. This is the second in our series of webinars that we've put together on trying to improve the relevance of drug interaction warnings, and appreciate those of you who joined our first webinar, and we welcome those of you that are joining us for the first time. We're going to be doing these approximately monthly, although we won't have one in April. We're planning on something for May, but tentatively on the 13th of May, but we'll provide more details as we get closer to that date about that particular webinar. A couple housekeeping rules that I want to establish as we get going here is, toward the end of the webinar, we'd like to open up for questions and discussions from those in the audience. To help facilitate that, if you could just use the chat function in Zoom to indicate that you would like to ask a question, our conference moderator will unmute you, and then you'll be able to have a microphone in order to for us to hear you. We're trying to do this to avoid people from talking on top of each other to the extent we can. And as we work through the audio technical issues with that, we'll just call on individuals as we can. So we've reserved some time toward the end of the webinar to do that. If you have questions during the webinar about the content as it comes up, then we'll be monitoring the chat, and we'll try and stop and address those questions throughout the webinar. We'll try to make this more of an informal presentation than a formal presentation. And we also have some resources that we'll share throughout the webinar, or links to resources through both our website and other materials, and we'll include that in our discussion. Okay, so briefly, I just want to acknowledge those of my colleagues that have been working on this project. Involves a number of individuals across the different universities, and this is all being supported by a project that is funded from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. So, I just realized maybe my window's not projecting correctly, but hopefully it is. So I've given a general overview of the ground rules, but I want to talk about the project for just a minute, and I apologize for those of you that heard this last time. Basically, we're going to be talking about drug-drug interactions in the context of clinical decision support. We recognize that most drug-drug interactions don't happen because basically we usually don't see a clinically meaningful alteration of the effect of one drug because we've administered a third or a second drug, excuse me, or a third or fourth. But usually what we're focusing on are potential drug-drug interactions. And these are situations where potential for harm exists, but patient doesn't experience it. So, with respect to drug interaction defenses, John Horn and Phil Hanston, who are on a call with us today, have come up with the modification of the James Reason human error Swiss cheese diagram. And each slice of Swiss cheese is indicated to be a defense, and yet when these holes line up, a patient is exposed to an adverse drug event. And we've been studying these various attributes of the defense mechanisms to prevent drug-drug interactions. And we know that we have a ways to go. And today we're going to focus primarily on the computer screening component of it. You know, most of you are quite well aware of how drug interaction warnings are currently triggered. It's a conventional alert looking in the patient's medication profile for a medication that might interact, and therefore the additional medication results in a warning being fired. What we're trying to do with our individualized drug interaction alerts, or what we're working on today, is trying to contextualize that information, taking into account both the drug factors and patient factors, and sending warnings when it's appropriate, but also trying to limit the warnings if we can. So here are the types of factors that we have commonly found in some of our algorithm developments. Things at the drug factor include the dose, duration, route of administration, how frequently the medications are given. Order of administration might be important in some interactions. And then the notion that patients could be exposed to not just a drug-drug pair, but many drug pairs, many drug combinations. On the patient side, patient comorbidities and prior medication history or risk factors in terms of diagnosis, diseases that they might have. Obviously, age plays a major role, as well as sometimes sex. Hepatic and renal impairment may be a factor. And as we get to more specialized data elements, such as pharmacogenomic information, we might be able to tailor these further. At this point in time, because that information is not largely available, we haven't attempted to incorporate that in our algorithms, but we hope in the future we will. So as I mentioned at the beginning, we're doing a series of webinars on specific drug pairs. Today, we're going to focus on warfarin and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents. During these webinars, we're going to try to cover the clinical pharmacology and why these drug pairs create a problem. And that's to help those of you that may not necessarily have a background in pharmacology or pharmacy or medicine. So those of you that are on the call that might be informaticists that are helping your colleagues design clinical decision support tools. We'll show you our algorithm that we've developed, and then also some results from testing of this particular algorithm. Then we're going to provide links to additional resources about how you could implement this algorithm, and some precautions, some things that we've run up against that you might want to consider. And then we'll also talk about our supporting documentation. Finally, I guess what's not on this slide, which I should have included, is just open forum. Kind of toward the end, we could talk about challenges and issues with trying to get these algorithms implemented, and also trying to move the needle on who has, or share experiences on who has been able to move the needle with regards to drug interaction warnings. So real quickly, we know that warfarin and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents are commonly used. In the United States today, about 2 million individuals are receiving long-term treatment with warfarin. That doesn't necessarily include those patients that might receive it for a relatively acute episode. We also know that the concomitant use of warfarin and NSAIDs is very common. Well, I shouldn't say very common, but frequent, more frequently than we'd like to admit. Years ago, we did a study looking at patients on warfarin, and we looked to see how many of them were also taking a prescription non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agent. And recognizing that this data is a little bit dated at this point in time, we found about 24% of the patients taking warfarin had also received a prescription non-steroidal anti-inflammatory. So that was a little alarming to us. So both of these medications increase the risk of gastrointestinal bleeding. And what I'd like to do next is turn it over to Dr. Phil Hanston, Professor Emeritus from the University of Washington, who will talk about this particular interaction from both the mechanism of the interaction and also the risk of harm. So, Phil, if you'd like to take it away, feel free.
Thanks, Dan. Greetings. It's great to be with you. And I'm working from home today, so I've told Yoda the cat to be quiet, but he's not known for following directions, just a warning. Next slide. So this one is a pretty straightforward drug interaction, as drug interactions go. Warfarin alone, of course, increases the bleeding risk, and because non-steroidals do affect the GI tract, one would expect an increased risk using the two together, especially in elderly patients, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There are many studies showing this. I'll just show you a couple. And the relative risk of bleeding is about double. The absolute risk is not huge, but the problem is that this can be life-threatening bleeding that can occur. So we really need to try to prevent it if we can. And it is a pharmacodynamic interaction, so you can't really monitor this looking at the INR. Okay, next slide. And this is just one of many studies. It's one of the best documented because of the number of patients. This was done in Europe, Netherlands, Italy, and Denmark. And they looked at people who developed an upper GI bleed, and each patient served as their own control. So they were able to eliminate some of the confounders by doing that. And if you look at the chart over on the right, one was by definition neither an oral anticoagulant or a non-steroidal. Then in green, you can see the oral anticoagulant alone increased the risk. In yellow, the non-steroidal alone increased the risk. And the two together, as you might guess, increased the risk substantially more. Whether this is synergism or not probably isn't that critical an issue. Just realize that the risk goes up substantially. Some studies have actually found even a higher risk than this, but this study had a lot of advantages over some of the others. Okay, next slide. Now they also, that same study, they looked at a number of other combinations with non-steroidals. And again, I won't go through the details of the study because we already talked about that. But if you look at the chart on the right, the incidence rate ratio with non-steroidals alone, again, was around 4. With SSRIs in green, it went up substantially, then even more with oral anticoagulants. And very interestingly, aldosterone antagonists were even worse than combining it with oral anticoagulants, and corticosteroids were the worst of all. Now, we knew this about aldosterone antagonists and corticosteroids before, but it wasn't recognized that the risk was this high. Now, the corticosteroids probably on their own don't have that much effect on bleeding. It's probable that what happens is the non-steroidal causes an ulcer, the steroid prevents the ulcer from healing and thereby increases the bleeding risk. Okay, next slide. So there are a number of risk factors. Ones that are established are a history of upper GI bleeds or a history of peptic ulcer, and being older. Some people use over 70, some over 60, but in any case, being older does seem to increase the risk. There are a number of possible risk factors that we've listed here. These are not as well established as the first two. But to give you an idea of the effect of age, on the next slide, this is a study done in Iceland. And as you can see here, they did upper GI endoscopy at the hospital, and they looked at the rate of bleeding at various ages. And you can see there's not much difference between 18 and what's the yellow there, and 59. But then when you go up to age 60 to 79, it's higher, and then age 80 to 105, it is drastically higher than it is at people who are younger, compared to people who are younger. Okay, I will turn it back to Dan.
Thanks, Phil. We know from other studies, and this is one of them, that just looking at the risk of warfarin alone in doubles the risk of bleeding, of gastrointestinal bleeding, but various combinations have shown that adding a non-steroidal to warfarin does seem to increase the risk of bleeding. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a very common combination among warfarin recipients. So what I want to do is introduce you to one of our fellows that have worked on this project, Dr. Lorenzo Villa, who's now at the Skaggs School of Pharmacy at the University of Colorado Ann Schultz Medical Campus. And we're going to show you some data that is in the process of being published related to the significance of this particular interaction. So Lorenzo, do you want to take it take it away.
Yes. Thank you, Dan. So we were interested to study the warfarin-NSAID interaction and how that interaction can trigger the occurrence of bleeding independently or as a result of a drug-drug interaction when warfarin is used in combination with NSAID. So, and specifically here, I'm going to show you the results related with gastrointestinal bleeding. So if you can show it. Yeah, here, the purpose of conducting this, we follow the MOOS guidelines, which is like a guidelines to run meta-analysis for observational studies. So we went into PubMed, Embase, and Scopus, as you can see there. And then we collected a total of 651 studies. And after applying all the exclusion criteria that we had, so we end up having 11 studies. Most of those studies, they were retrospective studies and case control studies. So the next one. And from those studies, from the 651 studies, we study the gastrointestinal bleeding, as we say, when we compare the use of warfarin alone and warfarin plus NSAID. And as you can see there, the odds ratio for gastrointestinal bleeding when exposed to warfarin and an NSAID was 1.99. And the next one, please. When when we look for the warfarin plus COX-2 drugs, we saw that the risk of gastrointestinal bleeding was also significantly elevated with exposure to COX-2 inhibitors and warfarin relative to warfarin alone. So as you can see there, the odds ratio is 1.9. So the main message about this study is that the principal findings were that the addition of an NSAID, including selective COX-2 inhibitors to warfarin, increased the risk of gastrointestinal bleeding nearly twofold relatively to warfarin alone. So Dan, back to you.
Thanks, Lorenzo. So as a part of our research, we've developed this particular algorithm, and I'd like to walk you through it. There's a number of decision points, and I'll try to explain things that we've done to try to make this algorithm efficient and as evidence-based as possible. So I'm going to look at the top half of the algorithm first. So one of the things that we identified in our data as we looked at this is just that there's a lot of topical ophthalmic and basically non-relevant NSAIDs that are triggering warnings that are not relevant for this particular interaction. So again, this is a gastrointestinal bleeding. It's a pharmacodynamic interaction. So one of the things that we like to filter out are medications that are not going to result in the anticipated harm because of their route of administration. Also, with respect to non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents, and we'll show you a list of this shortly, is that we focused on agents that are available both in the United States and also elsewhere. When we are looking at this, there's a lot of different non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents in the market. And when we put our list of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, we tried to be comprehensive. The first decision point after we've identified patients on both an agent of interest via warfarin and NSAIDs is whether the patient's on a proton pump inhibitor. Now, the evidence is relatively thin with respect to the ability of PPIs to prevent bleeding in warfarin and NSAID patients, meaning patients receiving both. But we do know that PPIs are protective. We also know that misoprostol is protective in terms of gastro irritation. So therefore, we're recommending that if patients are on these, that we're reducing the risk, and that's one way that patients can mitigate, and patients and their providers can mitigate harm associated with this particular interaction. Now notice that we've included this as a yellow box, so it's basically, it's not, the the risk has gone away completely, but it has been reduced substantially by taking some protective agent. As we go down the flow chart, if they're not on a PPI, we ask the question, our decision point is the patient able to start a PPI? If they are, it gets back to the same risk category, assess the risk and take action if possible. If they're not, then we really recommend that the patients not be taking these medications concurrently. This seems to be a rather, I guess, strong statement that patients shouldn't be on these medications, but based upon our review of the cases and the available evidence, it's really challenging for us to be able to discern which patients are going to be likely to bleed and which ones are not. Yeah, we do know that there are additional risk factors that you may want to incorporate into your own algorithm. We've initially, in early versions of our algorithm, included attributes of these, such as a history of upper gastrointestinal bleed or peptic ulcer. Older age, as Dr. Hanston mentioned earlier, we do know that older individuals are greater risk of gastrointestinal bleeding. In addition, there are other medications, as Phil mentioned, that can precipitate or increase the likelihood of bleeding. So these are other things that we've considered, although we haven't put them specifically in our flow diagram. And people would say, well, why haven't you done that? And I guess the main reason that we haven't tried to operationally include these agents is we don't have a strong sense of how much of a risk is increased by adding these agents on top of warfarin and an NSAID. So the evidence with many drug interactions gets rather thin, and in this particular case, it gets really thin when we start to look at these combination of agents and or these other confounding issues that may put patients at increased risk of bleeding. What I'd like to do next is turn it over to Dr. Subian, who's an assistant professor at the University of Arizona and in the College of Engineering. He's going to talk a little bit about our algorithms we've written and some preliminary testing with those. So, Anish, can I turn it over to you?
Thanks, Dan. So the decision, can you still hear me, Dan?
Yep, we can. Yeah.
Okay, great. So the decision tree that Dan walked us through is an overview of the algorithm that will be used to implement the clinical decision support. In this case, for the drug pair, Warfarin-NSAIDs. So we call this artifacts. Some of you may know artifacts as byproducts that are generated while developing a product. In the clinical decision support world, we use artifacts to refer to actionable medical knowledge from different sources. This can be from prior studies, peer-reviewed literature, clinical guidelines, and so on. Now, the decision tree by itself is an artifact, but it's not computable. So how do we translate this into a computable clinical decision support that can be interpreted by a computer and potentially interoperable with multiple systems? The next slide, Dan, where you could see the workflow of our process of testing the Warfarin-NSAIDs algorithm. So what you see on the right side is the decision tree, which is then converted into rules so that we can identify patients that satisfy a specified criteria for each decision in the algorithm. The rules by itself are written using Drools, which is a widely used enterprise rule engine, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then to test the rules, we can use either synthetic data or real-world data. So this is shown on the left side of the slide. So synthetic data here refers to simulated patient records to test various decision points in the algorithm that Dan walked us through. For example, we could simulate a record for a patient that is on warfarin and oral NSAIDs, as well as on a proton pump inhibitor, which should give us an alert saying that the patient is a low risk alert. We could also have simulated records for patients who are on the drug pair but unable to start on a proton pump inhibitor, and this should give us a high risk for bleeding alert. So we tested the algorithm on such synthetic or simulated data. We can also test the algorithm on real-world EHR data, which we are in the process of doing. So here we create an instance for each data source. And on the left side, you can see we are mapping it to a common data model. Here we use the Odyssey common data model, which is open source and widely used by the community to transform any clinical data to a standardized format. On the left bottom, you see an overview of the common data model showing the tables for various clinical data, such as demographics in the person table, diagnosis in the condition occurrence table, medication orders in the drug exposure table. On the top half of the data model, we have concepts and concept sets. The concept table includes concepts derived from standardized vocabularies, such as RxNOM, ICD-9, and SNOMED-CT. And concept sets, analogous to value sets, which also we'll talk about in a minute, are built from the concepts itself in the context of the algorithm. So for example, we can develop a concept set to represent exposure to warfarin and oral NSAIDs in a standardized way. So once the data is transformed using the common data model, we load them into the rules engine and run the rules in the algorithm against the data. The output is the alerts that are triggered for each patient record. So that's an overview of our workflow for testing our algorithm. Next slide. So we've tested the Warfarin-NSAIDs algorithm using synthetic data. So synthetic data, again, is simulated data for each of the branches in the algorithm. In this case, we have 3 branches, those on the drug pair, as well as protective factor proton pump inhibitor, or PPI, those on the drug pair and are able to start on the PPI, and those on the drug pair but are unable to start on PPI. We consider each of the rules as validated if we are able to pass our synthetic or simulated data records through the correct branch. We haven't completed testing this particular algorithm on real-world data yet, but we have done so for other algorithms, which we will present in future webinars. Next slide. So we also have a description of the algorithm and associated knowledge artifacts on our website. You can see the link on the slide. We will also post a link on the chat for you. Next slide. We also have supporting documentation on our website that summarizes the rationale for the algorithm, a narrative walkthrough of the decision tree, along with associated evidence and some implementation details. Next slide. You will also find resources on the artifacts for those of you who wish to implement this in your health system. These resources include the decision tree or the flow diagram of the algorithm, an executable artifact that is implemented in Drools and associated value sets, as well as an implementation guide. The value sets in particular are important here because it tells you what exactly we mean by exposure to warfarin and or oral NSAIDs and so on. We also have artifacts for clinical quality language. Next slide. So clinical quality language, or CQL, is an HL7 standard. It expresses the logic or rules in the algorithm as a human readable document, but it also gives you a structured executable artifact for electronic processing. In this project, we used the CQL code that operates with the HL7 FIRE specification, and we have developed and tested using the CQL testing framework that you will see on our website. Next slide. As I mentioned in the workflow, we also have executable artifacts in the form of the Drools rule engine. Specifically, we have Dockerized containers that you could customize for your own use case. For example, if you want to choose a specific rule of interest in the algorithm, you could do that. You could also use your own common data model if you wish to do so. And all of that are in our GitHub repository, which is also a part of our resource in our website. Next slide. I want to briefly talk about the value sets again. So value sets are a collection of codes from one or more standardized terminologies. And these are useful for representing medications, conditions, or other items of interest in electronic health records. In this particular project, for example, a value set for warfarin or oral NSAIDs might include all of the clinical drug codes from RxNOM. that are part of the medication drug order in the electronic health record. And clinical consequences includes diagnosis based off ICD-9 or 10 or SNOMED. So taking the medications and, for example, diagnosis, we could create a value set, and all of that are represented in two places. It's in our GitHub repository, but it's also can be accessed through the value set data repository maintained by the National Library of Medicine. And we'll quickly show you how to access that. Next slide. So the Value Set Authority Center is maintained by the National Library of Medicine. It's open source, but you do have to create an account to access the different value sets. For example, next slide, we can show you the value sets for NSAID. So these are value sets for NSAIDs that we used in our project. Dan, do you want to add a little bit more about value sets?
Yeah, so one of the issues that comes up with specifically the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs is the issue of, what do you do with aspirin and salicylates, and do you consider those a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agent? So in our particular value set, we did not include salicylates, in specifically aspirin, as a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agent. We have a separate algorithm that we've developed for warfarin and salicylates. And I think some of the knowledge database vendors, such as First Data Bank and Warfarin, probably put those as separate warning systems. If any of those individuals would like to comment on that, they feel free to add that to the chat or to vocalize it here. We get to the Q&A. But I wanted to be clear that our NSAID concept set did not include warfarin or salicylates. I'm sorry, aspirin or salicylates. It only included, I guess, what I would call a more narrow set of non-steroidal anti-inflammatories.
Thanks, Dan. So just to add, again, all of our value sets are on our GitHub repository. It's also in a text form if you want to view what are the specific codes that we use, for example, RxNorm codes for drugs. You should be able to find that. Next slide. Back to you, Dan.
All right. Well, thanks, Vinesh. Appreciate that. I just, in the chat, Steve Sklar said that Walter's Chlor does handle these separately regarding warfarin interactions. So thanks, Steve. Appreciate that information. Many of you on the call are probably in organizations that are having challenges with drug-drug interaction warnings being non-specific and creating alert fatigue. And the whole premise of our work is to try to address that particular issue. We've engaged or reached out to various organizations, software vendors, talked to about our algorithms, and I know that perhaps some of them are on the call today. Trying to move the needle on improving how we can provide meaningful clinical decision support on these interactions to clinicians as part of the workflow. We'd love to hear feedback from those of you on the call on some of the challenges, some of the issues that you might have with implementing, say, this algorithm or any of the algorithms that we present. So we'll open it up for discussion along those lines. If some of you have been able to implement some algorithms, would like to talk about that and share it with your colleagues while we're on the line together, I think that would be fantastic as well. And I just received, all of you probably, well, maybe not all of you, but some of you might have seen the comment that First Data Bank also handles these separately, salicylates and NSAIDs separately. So thanks, Christine, for providing that information. Yeah, so there, so David, I see your comment to the panelists. I'll read it and then we'll open up your microphone. So the issue about chronicity of NSAID use, how is that being considered? And scheduled versus PRN orders. And one of the challenges that our algorithm doesn't do very well is this notion of scheduled versus non-scheduled medications and how the various software systems handle that issue. With respect to the risk of bleeding, we think that obviously chronic use of the NSAIDs is probably more likely to cause harm. On the other hand, none of the data that we looked at from I guess an observational data set gave us any sense of the duration of dose, what have you. But Lorenzo, do you want to open up your microphone and maybe answer that question directly? You're more familiar with that data than I am.
So yeah, when we collect all those papers that we use for the meta-analysis, so some of them, they reported like a gastrointestinal bleeding in a week of using concomitant NSAIDs and warfarin. So that's the evidence that we have. So at least for a week of use of concomitant warfarin and NSAID, so then you can see patients suffering of gastrointestinal bleeding.
Phil, do you want to chime in on this at all?
Yes, I agree. And you would expect that the longer they were on the NSAID, the greater the risk. But as was just said, it can happen relatively quickly, especially in somebody who's predisposed.
Yeah, there is a specific case in the literature where a patient received just a couple days of NSAIDs and ultimately ended up expiring due to extensive bleeding. So there is a case report of that. So.
Yes.
Other issues or elements that people would like to address? You know, one of the things, I'm sorry. One of the things about our algorithm is it's rather simplistic in looking at use of proton pump inhibitors, and it doesn't incorporate all of these other elements like prior history of gastrointestinal bleeding. And as I mentioned earlier, versions of our algorithm did try to take those into account. We do have a list of ICD-9 codes and ICD-10 codes associated with gastrointestinal bleeding history of. We've not put that in our current version, but if anybody would like to reach out to us, we do have that list available. And it might make sense in some organizations to address that. There's a couple caveats that I wanted to make sure that we brought to the table, and that was when we were considering this, we're largely considering warfarin in adults. So this algorithm probably would not be appropriate to be implemented in a pediatric environment, although quite frankly, we wouldn't expect too many pediatric patients to receive warfarin. So that's a caveat for this. I'm just looking at the chat boxes here. Yeah, so the comment is, outside of eliminating the non-oral NSAIDs, this doesn't necessarily seem to reduce the number of alerts, only what would be provided based upon PPI use. So David, your comment along those lines is fairly correct. We did do a chart review study applying the algorithm to 50 patients and looking to see if they actually were on a PPI. And quite frankly, most patients taking warfarin and a non-steroidal had not received a PPI. So at this point in time, I guess the tool would continue to generate probably just as many warnings that we see currently. but it might give the provider something actionable to do to mitigate the risk. So that's a good comment.
And Dan, could I throw something in? This is Phil.
Yeah, feel free.
Also, in addition to trying to reduce the number of alerts, the other thing we're trying to do is to fine tune them a bit so that one pathway down the algorithm might end up with a red box with, you know, a greater danger, and another pathway might lead to a yellow box. So it's not just reducing the number of alerts, but also making them, fine tuning them so they're a little more specific.
Yeah, and we do know that some of the drug-drug interaction knowledge providers have allowed some customization of those warnings based upon alert severity, what have you. So therefore, some of those branches may be suppressed to certain providers or maybe all individuals in their organization. So another question is, so David, if you want to speak, your ability to, you can feel free to unmute yourself if you want to ask the question directly. All right, I'll go ahead and read your chat. It was, we didn't include data on PPI prevention of bleeds. So yeah, we didn't have that information. Is PPIs more effective than other acid suppressive therapies in terms of reducing bleeds? Anybody want to take that question? That's a great question. I'm not sure what the answer is. I guess we're going to have to say that that's probably an unanswered question. I don't, I said, there's a fairly extensive data set about proton pump inhibitors, but we didn't actually go out to look to see if it reduced bleeds per se. You know, we didn't look at that evidence necessarily. It's a great question. And by the way, all of you who are on the call should be able to speak. We've given the ability for any individual to unmute themselves and ask a question if they'd like. Okay, well, if there are no other questions or if there are other issues, I'm kind of wrapping this up. We're going to provide this webinar as a video recording on our website. It'll take us probably a couple weeks to get that up. So feel free to share that link and information with your colleagues. Once we make it available, we'll send it out to all the registrants of the webinar. Also, anticipate a third in our series to be available in May. The topic is yet to be determined. We're looking at a couple of different drug pairs. Also, if you have colleagues that you think would be interested in learning more about what we're doing and maybe some of these artifacts and the materials, please feel free to share our website, DDI-CDS.org. All of our work is open source and available for anyone to use. So this is a link to our website. I apologize for that. We also encourage you to connect to us via our discussion forums. As we all know that there's a lot of problems with our current drug interaction safety net, and obviously with the Warfarin-NSAIDs, it's a lot of patients being exposed to harm, and we'd like to hopefully reduce the harm associated with that particular warning. And finally, I just want to acknowledge the sponsor of our research is the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. They take no responsibility with respect to the content that we present or the views of those of been on the call today or any of our publications, but we would like to acknowledge their support of our research and appreciate all of you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us for this call today. With that, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you very much, and best wishes for continued success. Have a good day.